Welcome to lecture number 4. Today we'll focus on social cognition. A way I like to summarize this is it's the social world inside our own heads, our social reality as influenced by the way we think about it. So an intriguing question for today is to think about how your explanation, or as social psychologists can sometimes say, attribution for someone's behavior, is influenced by your attitudes that you hold about that person. That is, does your explanation for a person's behavior somehow be influenced by the attitudes that you already have about that person? So before we begin getting into the content today, a couple of announcements. First of all, don't forget to do the reserve reading for our next class. That's the Word It All reading. It's downloadable on the Blackboard site, and it will be assessed on the exam, and it's relevant to an activity that we'll do. In addition, as a reminder, if you're not sure of the due date for your In the News posting, please ask me. And finally, code of conduct. So, as we think about social cognition, an interesting concept that social psychology has discovered is the idea of stereotype threat. Stereotype is a type of mental representation, and what this is indicating, what this concept is indicating, is that our awareness of, or our stereotype, mental representation of a certain social category, such as African American, or old, or young, these kinds of stereotypes can actually influence the people who are being stereotyped. So if you look at this website that I've indicated here on the slide, you'll see an interesting discussion by Claude Steele about his research on this concept. It's also indicated in your textbook. So on to the topic of social cognition, of which stereotype is an example. Social cognition is a process of thinking about and making sense of yourself and others in the social world. I've repeatedly referred to the process of priming as the process of bringing a particular concept, mental representation, schema, exemplar, etc., into consciousness, and once it's brought into your conscious awareness, then it begins to have a more active role in influencing the way that you perceive the situation, what you focus on, how you interpret it, and what you make as a judgment, and maybe what you remember. So for example, all of us have mental representations of a variety of different kinds of things in the world. And mental representations, once they're primed, work a little bit like spreading activation that you might have heard about in another psychology course, such as Psych 111. Spreading activation is recognizing that you have a number of different connections in your thinking, in your memories, connections between different ideas that are related. So in a mental representation, there may be a number of different beliefs, and as you activate or prime one of those beliefs, it will spread out and activate or bring into consciousness a related idea. So for example, when I say bread, many of you will begin thinking about butter or sandwiches. Many of you might think of the Great Harvest Bread Company. These are examples of how, when I stimulate or prime and bring into consciousness your latent memory of bread, a number of related concepts around your mental representation of bread are activated and brought into consciousness. Now, sometimes individuals have different mental representations. So some of the older students might remember that bread is a slang term, an old American slang term for money. And so many of you might have thought, oh, bread, money, cash, ways of buying things. So it's important to remember that our mental representations are often shared by a number of people who exist in the same culture. Now, once we prime that idea of bread, then we can begin to think about how if we were in a situation, we might focus our attention on any bread-related items that might be in that environment. So that's an example of social cognition. I chose a non-social mental representation, but imagine, if you will, if I said something like Alaska Native. Many of you might begin to think about what an Alaska Native is like. What are your beliefs and memories, sensory memories, explanations for certain things that you believe about Alaska Natives? Or Irish American males. Whatever the concept is, you can prime mental representations that you have as an individual that you might share with others. There might be some unique aspects for yourself, but many things that you share in common with others that grew up in the same culture. Let's move on to some other concepts relating to social cognition. There are 4 core processes of social cognition. These are things that mental processes that influence the way our thinking impacts our social behavior. The first of these is attention. This is the process of consciously focusing on features of the environment or consciously focusing on aspects of yourself. Attention tends to be limited. It's a limited resource. We don't have an unlimited amount of attention to invest in things, and so we tend to focus on different features of the environment and ignore other features of the environment. Similarly, when you think about yourself, you can't think of every single thing about yourself at the same time. You focus on certain parts of yourself. The idea here is that attention requires focus, and that means ignoring other things. We tend to focus our attention on a very small slice of reality. Interpretation. Interpretation is the process through which we give meaning to the events we experience. Many social situations can be interpreted in more than one way. Reality is subjective. It's socially constructed. Many people in a situation may see a situation in slightly different ways, but together, through communication, verbal and otherwise, they may arrive at a general or social consensus about what reality is in that situation. Gee, this is an exciting party, isn't it? Or, God, this is really boring. So the same party is experienced slightly different ways by many people, but together they may come to a consensus judgment in their interpretation of that social environment. We also make judgments. This is the process of using information to form impressions and make decisions. Before we have, because we have limited information, or we focused our attention on certain aspects of the environment, sometimes our social judgments are only best guesses. They're not the most informed decisions. We make social judgments sometimes after only a brief exposure to a person. So you meet a person at a party, you learn a few little things about him or her, and then you interpret that information, and then you make a judgment. Am I going to move on to a different conversation? Am I going to continue talking to this person? Do I spread slanderous rumors about this person? Based on your exposure, a little bit of information about that person, you interpret and then make some judgments about how you will behave. Memory. Memory is storing and retrieving information for future use. As you've directed your attention to certain aspects of the environment, as you've begun to interpret what you're focusing your attention on and making judgment, eventually you'll take all of that information and how you've experienced it and put it into memory. It will then be part of the mental representations that you bring into new social situations. And as those social situations are similar to past experience, you may have an influence on your future interpretation, future attention focus, and judgment and memory. So our past begins to inform the way we perceive the future. An important thing to remember about memory is memory in human beings is not photographic. What I mean by this, some of us have visual memory, that's fine. But what I mean by this is that our memories are not perfect. Neither are they permanent. They can be eroded over time, and they can also become contaminated. So we have incomplete and imprecise memories of our social world. So it's important to remember that when we feel very confident about what we remember, that may not necessarily mean that we are necessarily accurate in what we remember. So here's a research example of one of the core processes of social cognition. So memory can influence our decisions by creating expectations that affect the way we pay attention to and how we interpret information that's relevant to that memory. In addition, how we focus our attention in a situation can affect the way we interpret, and it has an impact on forming new memories, repeating the cycle and strengthening the influence it may have on our social behavior. So let's look at this research example that illustrates these ideas. So the broader research question here is, does media influence or media bias exist only in the eye of the beholder? Is it something that the media does, or to some extent is it something that the viewer does? In this study, students like yourself were measured on an attitude scale to indicate whether they were generally pro-Israeli in their political leanings or pro-Palestinian in their political leanings. And then these groups of students watched identical news broadcasts of a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Later, they were asked to evaluate the degree to which they thought the news reports that they viewed were biased towards either side of the conflict. In this slide, we see that the memory and perception of the media presentations depended upon the pre-existing attitudes of the individuals who viewed those things. So compared to neutral students, pro-Israeli students thought the presentations were biased against Israelis. In contrast, or as a difference, we see that the pro-Palestinian students thought not perception. They believed that the news were less biased towards Israelis and perhaps a little bit more biased towards Palestinians. So that's an important indication that the attitudes and memories that people bring to their viewing of the same news item affect their judgment and memory of that news item when they're later asked about it. One of the classic social psychology studies that also illustrates this kind of effect was the memories that college students had of a particularly contentious football game between Princeton and Dartmouth. It's one of an early social psychology study that shows that people, depending upon their attitudes towards the football teams, had very different recollections of what happened. And I'll try to post a link to that so you can enjoy that kind of humorous example as well, how our sympathies for one college team or another affect the way that we view the game. And as we approach the Super Bowl, that might be interesting to view at our homes as well. Now, social cognition can lead to life and death decisions. One of the things that you can read about as an optional reading on the Blackboard site is how expectations of one race or another might actually impact the judgments people make about ambiguous stimulus. That is, if you're not sure whether a person is pulling a cell phone out of their pocket or a pistol, the race of that individual might affect the interpretation and judgment. So be sure to check out that study if you think it's an interesting idea to consider. Here's an example from the media that I found several years ago during Hurricane Katrina. What we have here, if you look at the fine print, are essentially two situations that are identical. They're not exactly the same, but we have a person wading through these floodwaters with a plastic bag, and some other people here wading through the floodwaters, one with a backpack and one with a plastic bag with some groceries in it. And then when we look at the interpretations of the media, you see that those individuals who are writing for the media seem to have very different interpretations of what looks like the same behavior when we look at maybe the race of these. The young man is described as walking through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store. On the other hand, our white shoppers are two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. So this fellow is looting. These people are simply finding bread and soda from the store. So the next time you want to do some shoplifting, just remind people that you're finding stuff. Interesting example there. All right, some goals of social cognition that are important to understand in understanding how our thinking processes can affect our social interpretations and our social behaviors. One is conserving mental effort, and the other is managing self-image. We'll talk about seeking accuracy in our next class. So with this in mind, I want to point out that the social world that we exist in is very complex, information-rich, and all around us there's so much information that we could potentially attend to. As you sit in any social situation, you could notice the clothing that a person's wearing. You can notice the accessories that they have. You can notice their tone of voice. You can notice the color of their skin. You could notice what cologne they're wearing. You could notice some indications of how much money they have by the types of clothing that they're wearing. There's so much you could pay attention to. You could notice the interactions between some individuals are positive, some are negative. However, you cannot focus on all of these things at the same time. We have limited human capacity for attending to the information in our environment. We have to focus. And so one of our goals in social cognition is to conserve or focus our mental efforts. And so we often rely upon simplification strategies to avoid being overwhelmed by the endless amounts of stimulation that are out there in the environment. So some simplification strategies include relying on expectations based on our previous experiences, our expectations coming from mental representations. We also use some logic strategies, dispositional inferences, we'll talk about those in a moment, and also cognitive shortcuts. We'll talk about a few examples, and there are many different types of cognitive or reasoning shortcuts. So conserving mental effort. We often tend to think in ways that tend to preserve our expectations. Once we have expectations, we guide our mental effort to focus on those kinds of things that confirm our expectations. Reality that fits our expectations is easiest to deal with, it's easiest to think about. When something doesn't fit our expectations, we have to puzzle over it and invest more mental energy. Reality that doesn't fit our expectations tends to be more difficult to deal with. And so we try to avoid those kinds of focusing our attention. We pay attention to behaviors that are relevant to our expectations. So for example, a math teacher who expects a Chinese American boy to have good math skills is more likely to notice when he performs well and tends to ignore or get confused when that Asian American male doesn't perform so well in math. We also tend to remember people and events in ways that are consistent with our expectations. He tends to forget the Chinese boys who are only average at math, or he tends to remember those Chinese boys who are very good at math, but forgets those who did not do so well. We also tend to interpret ambiguous events or kind of mixed events in ways that support our expectations. So a police officer who is suspicious of a teenage male may interpret the boy's reaching for his wallet as going for a weapon. Another way of conserving mental effort is to make dispositional inferences. What we mean by dispositional inferences is making the judgment that a person's behavior was caused by his or her personality or disposition. Disposition is just kind of a fancy name for personality. So when we make a dispositional inference, we say that a person's behavior must have been caused by his or her personality. That's somewhat easier than thinking of all the possible situational influences on the person's behavior. So just think for a moment that you see someone speeding down Northern Lights Boulevard. They're driving very fast and erratically. They're going, weaving in and out of traffic. One example of dispositional inference is something that we call the correspondence bias, or sometimes also referred to as the fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency for observers like yourself to overestimate the causal influence of personality or dispositional factors on behavior and to underestimate the causal role of situational influences. So back to our guy driving like crazy down Northern Lights. When you see something like that, your first tendency is to think, whoa, what a bad driver, what a reckless person, what an idiot. Those kinds of judgments are judgments about that person's personality. What you're less likely to think about is why or what situation might be causing that person to drive that way. So the situational influences are many different possibilities, more so than the limited number of personality or disposition influences. You think, oh, they're careless, they're reckless, they are impulsive, these kinds of things. But there are a huge number of situations that could cause a person to drive fast and erratically. Maybe they're escaping a person who's got road rage. Maybe they are late for a job interview. Maybe their wife is in the back seat having labor and they're rushing to get to the hospital. Or maybe they have a sick child that they need to get to the hospital. But we don't tend to focus on those situations. Instead, the correspondence bias or fundamental attribution error leads us to think about how the person's behavior is caused by a particular personality or disposition characteristic. Flipping that around, when we're explaining our own behavior, not explaining the behavior of others, but when we're explaining our own behavior, we instead judge our own behaviors as caused by situational forces, and relative to explaining the behavior of others, as we just said, we tend to think of other people as being caused, their behavior as being caused by their personality. So the actor-observer difference is the difference between explaining our own behavior as being influenced by the situation around us and explaining the behaviors of others as being influenced by his or her personality. So when you're speeding down Northern Lights, you don't think of what a reckless driver you are. You think about how you're in a hurry to get to your girlfriend or your job interview or your social psychology class. So I said that there are a number of different mental shortcuts or cognitive heuristics that we can use. There are a great number of these things. Just let me give you a few, and also you can review in the textbook a number of other ones. So one is the representative heuristic. Representative heuristic is when we see something that makes us think that a person must belong in a certain social category that something represents. So for example, if you see a person in a white lab coat, you might immediately conclude, oh, that person must be a scientist, because only scientists wear that type of clothing. This white lab coat is representative of our mental image or representation of what a scientist is. Okay? Another example of a mental heuristic is when we use anchoring and adjustment. Basically, if we're not quite sure of ourselves in making a judgment or an estimate, we'll use information that's present as a starting point. So if I say to you, is the average home price in Anchorage $300,000? and you're not really sure, then you're going to make an estimate that's pretty close to $300,000. On the other hand, if I said the same question to another group of students who weren't quite sure, and I said, is the average housing price in Anchorage $500,000, those students would make an estimate closer to $500,000. They anchor or base their estimate on what I've provided in the conversation. Another social cognition effect is false consensus. Here's an example that may come across a little bit difficult in this lecture audio, but bear with me. If you had to choose one, just think about it, would you prefer to die by fire or to die by drowning? Okay. Think about that for a moment. Now estimate the percentage of your classmates who would prefer to die by fire and those that would prefer to die by drowning. Now if we were actually to take a poll of the individuals, we typically find that most people prefer to die by drowning. Okay, but those people who say they individually prefer to die by fire tend to overestimate the number of students who say they would die by fire. So the basic phenomenon here is we tend to believe that people share our opinions or beliefs. That's the false consensus. The false consensus is to have an inflated estimate of how many people agree with us. So when we overestimate the percentage of people who agree with us, we are engaging in false consensus. We also sometimes have false uniqueness. This is in a situation where a person tends to think that the talent or skill that they have is particularly unique when many other people may share the same level of talent or skill. So as we're continuing with this theme of conserving mental effort, let's look at some research examples. We have research examples that focus on the individual, research example that focuses on the situation, and research example that looks at the interaction. So one feature of the individual is that we all have circadian rhythms. These are daily rhythms, and some of us have circadian rhythms that are quite different than others. Some of us tend to be morning people, and some of us tend to be more evening people. And this is based on cycles of physiological arousal. Basically, those people who are morning people, their physiology, their biology, tends to become more activated. Their metabolism is moving faster, is more active earlier in the day. And those people we would describe as evening people tend to have more or greater physiological arousal later in the evening. One thing that's important to think about in terms of arousal and social cognition is that morning people tend to use cognitive shortcuts later in the day. That is, when their physiology is less aroused, they tend to use more mental shortcuts during that period. Evening people, in contrast, tend to use their cognitive shortcuts in the morning. So basically, when you're more sleepy, you use more mental shortcuts. So morning people use them late in the day, evening people use them in the morning. Pardon me, my cough is coming back apparently. We also see social cognition is affected by the situation. Complex situations where there's a lot of stimulation or urgency tends to impact the extent to which we use mental shortcuts. Complex situations tend to use up more of our attention and lead us to rely on cognitive shortcuts more frequently. This is because it takes time to fully interpret a social situation, and as we are challenged with our attention, we are more likely to rely on cognitive shortcuts, and this is particularly true if we have to make a decision in a hurry. One example from my own life that I recall that's like this is that when I remember my mom being kind of stressed out by all of us kids running around, making noise, arguing, diverting her attention, using up her attentional resources, sometimes she would make a cognitive shortcut in referring to us kids and just sort of lump us all into the same category and confuse our names because she wasn't really thinking of us as individuals, but thinking of us rather as a whole social category. And some of you might have some experiences in your own family like that. Finally, let's look at a situation. Sometimes we have expectations about the world, and as we enter that situation, the situation may not fit our expectations exactly. And when this happens, that is, when we are challenged by evidence in the social world that doesn't meet our expectations, we are actually less likely to use cognitive shortcuts and more likely to kind of pause and think more carefully about our situation. Much of the time we ignore or fail to notice behavior that doesn't fit our expectations. However, when we're really directly confronted with evidence that doesn't fit our expectations, that's when we are motivated to try to understand those exceptions. This is particularly true in situations that are relevant to ourselves and when we depend on others around us. We're much more motivated in those kinds of situations to develop a detailed and individualized understanding so that we can better predict and control our social environment. So let's look at the goal of managing self-image. Most of us have a desire to see ourselves as effective, and we also desire ourselves to have good relationships. And so these both feed into a goal of managing our self-image, to present to others an effective self-concept and present to others a likable person. Both of these feed into the goal of managing our self-image, and the goal of managing our self-image relates to other specific processes such as social comparison and self-serving attributions. So let's look at those two concepts. So some cognitive strategies for enhancing or protecting yourself. These are social comparison processes. So if you want to either feel better about yourself or protect yourself from feeling bad, you can engage in what's referred to as downward social comparison with others who are less well off. So, for example, if you want to feel good about your academic performance, and you don't want to feel bad about your academic performance, a really good way of doing that is to find someone who is doing more poorly than yourself on that particular dimension of comparison. So you find someone who, let's say you got a B on the exam. You find someone in your class who earned a C or a D, and you focus on that information and you start to feel like, hey, that B's not so bad. That other person got a D after all. That's a downward social comparison. It serves to enhance your self-concept and to protect yourself against feeling badly about that particular part of your self-concept or performance. You can also make upward social comparisons. This is the process of comparing yourself to those who are better off than ourselves. Now you might ask yourself, why is this enhancing? Why would a person engage in an upward social comparison? Well, it has to do with motivation. When we are, say, earning a B in the class, but we might want to be enhancing ourselves and earning an A, making a comparison to a student who's similar to ourselves but performing better, it does feel a little bit bad, but it may motivate us to engage in behaviors that will later enhance the self when we get a better grade. We also engage in self-serving attributions. Remember, an attribution is a social psychologist's way of saying explanation for the cause of behavior. So let's look at some examples here of self-serving attributions. If you were to get a really good grade on the first exam, let's say if you get an A on that first exam in social psychology, what would your explanation or attribution for that be? What caused your performance? Was it because you're so smart? Is it because you studied hard and were well disciplined? Those would be examples that enhance or serve yourself. You say, oh, well, it's because I'm so smart, and that I like that about myself, and that's something to be respected and admired by others. So that's a self-serving explanation or cause for your exam performance. What if you get a lousy grade? What if you get like a D on the first exam? Wouldn't it be kind of helpful to say, well, the reason is that the exam was so hard, it was unfair, it was unreasonable. Dr. Bachman's study guide sucked. Okay? Or you could say that I'm a really crappy teacher and these voiceover lectures are really sort of stupid and difficult to follow. That would be an explanation that helps you feel good about or protects yourself when you have a bad grade. It's quite unusual, for example, when a person gets a good grade to say something like, oh, well, it was such an easy test. You know, it's not because I'm smart. It was a really easy test. So that would not be a self-serving attribution. Another general tendency we see, and it's described by social psychologists as a self-serving bias, is the tendency to take credit for our successes and to blame external factors for our failures. So that's a general tendency by most people to take credit for successes. It's me, I did that, and to blame external or situational factors on a failure. Why did you get promoted? Well, because I'm such a great salesperson. Why did you get laid off? Well, because my employer hates me and the economy's bad, not because I was a bad worker. So here's a research example of self-serving bias, and you'll see that there's a bit of an interaction here. Actually, no, this one doesn't show an interaction, but let's take a look at it anyway. This is a self-serving bias, and this is kind of clever because it isn't really an experiment in the laboratory. It's more of an observational study, okay, and it really requires kind of some careful thinking about baseball of all things. So this is a systematic analysis of newspaper articles that describe 33 major baseball and football games in the newspapers. And these are quotations from both players and coaches that were analyzed in terms of how they perceived their teams winning or losing. So what we see that's consistent with the self-serving bias is when teams won, the vast majority of quotations tended to emphasize internal explanations. Okay? We are responsible for our victory, and when you look at defeats, people were less likely to claim personal responsibility or team responsibility for the defeat. On the other hand, when you look at defeats, external explanations tend to dominate. So, oh, the field was muddy, the referees were unfair, the other team was cheating, these kinds of explanations for defeat. Okay? Now, in terms of self-esteem, this is another aspect of the individual. Generally speaking, people with high self-esteem are more likely to inflate their self-importance and exaggerate their sense of control on outcomes that pertain to them. In contrast, people with low self-esteem are more cautious, and they tend to focus on protecting rather than inflating their self-concepts. There are some cultural differences. People from individualist cultures tend to have a greater self-enhancement bias than individuals coming from collective cultures. Now, with that reminder, just would point out that you can look at the results of your self-concept measure and see whether you tend toward the more individualistic side of cultures or the more collectivist side of cultures. Thank you. That ends today's lecture.